unbelievable trials and catastrophes that your husband and you have been through is something like, and I'm not claiming this is the case at all, I'm just saying what popped into my mind, and certainly this is an accusation that's been leveled at me, is that someone in that much trouble must have done something wrong. And I would say, well, probably that's true to some degree because everybody has done something wrong. It's a very dangerous assumption because given that each of us has probably done something wrong, that means that we can be called out on it arbitrarily and with force when that's in the interest of people whose interests we've opposed. And then also, the fact that that's the case, that that sort of doubt can be elicited, means that people who are inclined to take you out for whatever reason have an easy pathway to doing it. And maybe that would bring us to what happened in Sweden. So it wasn't very, and I have some personal questions to ask you on that front. And you're obviously welcome to not answer any questions that I might pose to you. And I hope I don't do it rudely and inappropriately. But it wasn't long after this vast trove of documents was published, and you're now making a case that they were actually published with a fair bit of care, and maybe even to a lesser degree than they might have validly been published. It wasn't long after that before the authorities in Sweden brought charges against your husband in relationship to sexual misconduct. That was in 2010. It's very interesting to me that it was Sweden. Your husband, Julian, described Sweden as the Saudi Arabia of feminism, which I thought was a pretty nice phrase, by the way. And there's definitely something to be said about that. And that was also at the height or in the prodroma to the Believe All Women and Me Too, what would you call it, brouhaha, and the insistence that if any charges of sexual misbehavior were ever brought against someone, that it was incumbent on everyone to assume that the victim was telling the truth. And of course, that violates the presumption of innocence. It often violates your right to face your accuser. And it's preposterous on the face of it, because what that does is enable anyone who's manipulative or devious or psychopathic to use the entire weight of the legal system as a weapon, which is happening so often now that it's almost beyond comprehension. And it seems a bit too convenient in some real sense that these charges emerged just at the time that was most appropriate in some real pragmatic sense for the authorities in the UK and the US. But I'd ask you also more personally, I mean, you married this man, you had an affair with him for a long time, you have 2 children together. For some reason, either you didn't believe the charges and the allegations, or you saw something in Julian that superseded them of value. And so, and this is a deeper question too. I mean, you've got tangled in this pretty deeply, and you could have had a much simpler life. And so, why are you on his side? Why isn't it reasonable just to assume that Julian Assange is a narcissistic troublemaker with a proclivity for sexual impropriety? And why do you believe that so deeply that, well, in some real sense, you were willing to stake your whole life on it? And why aren't you just being played? And I'm not saying that you are, but obviously those are the questions that that all the people who are launching allegations against your husband and you, those are the claims that they're putting forward, essentially.
Well, Julian is the man I know. The man I married, I know, wouldn't do those things. And in fact, the way he's described is the exact opposite of who he is. And that's not how I came into this, though. I came into it in a professional capacity, precisely in the context of these Swedish allegations. And you made a mistake, which is completely understandable, because you read everywhere that Julian was charged, but in fact, he was never charged. There was only ever a...
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was only ever a so-called preliminary investigation, and it was dropped on 4 separate occasions.
So why was there an extradition order if it was only a preliminary investigation?
Right, and...
Or is that exactly the issue?
No, look, that is a very good question. And in fact, Julian's case went all the way to the Supreme Court. He lost, and the UK Supreme Court said he should be extradited to Sweden. And then they said, and we have to change the law so this doesn't happen again because you need a charge before we extradite, but it won't be retrospective.
Oh, I see.
So they
I see,
legislated,
I see.
but carved out a little exception for Julian so he wouldn't benefit from it. And that has been the norm again and again and again, that somehow Julian is treated as the exception and then we're going to fix it afterwards.
What were the allegations exactly? What were the Swedish allegations? And how many people brought them forward? And why weren't they pursued?
So according, there were two women, and according to their own account, they went to police because they had found out that both of them had slept with Julian within a week, and they wanted Julian to have an HIV test. That is their reason, according to their own account, for going to the police.
And you can go to the police in Sweden for that reason?
Well, who knows? But just to put this in context.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so Julian had just published the the Afghan war logs in July, 25th of July, I think it was, or so. The Swedish preliminary investigation was opened on the 20th of August. But in between that, even before he went to Sweden, there was an article in the Daily Beast which said that the US State Department was telling its allies to find a way to stop Julian in his tracks and to find a way to prosecute him. And they knew that Julian still had to publish the Afghan war logs and the diplomatic cables. The Iraq war logs. The Iraq war logs were published in October, and the diplomatic cables on the 29th of November. Sweden issued its Interpol arrest warrant on the 30th of November, one day later. Julian voluntarily went to the police station and lost his liberty on the 7th of December 2010. He was put in prison for 10 days, then he was under house arrest for a year and a half. He was in the embassy for 7 years, then he was arrested, and he's been in Belmarsh High Security Prison ever since.
So the women wanted him to undergo an HIV test, but that's still not allegation of misbehavior. Although who knows in Sweden, what were the specific allegations? And you said the allegations were dropped before formal charges were brought on 4 separate occasions. So what were the allegations?
So there are 4 allegations, 3 in relation to one woman and 1 in relation to the other. The single allegation which was most serious is what they called lesser rape. So there are 3 degrees of rape in Sweden, and this was the lesser degree, in the sense that there was no physical coercion. And the allegation is that Julian initiated sex when the woman was asleep. The Swedish police had text messages from the women which they refused to hand over to the defense. And those text messages exonerated Julian, and his defense lawyers, were able to read them at the police station, but were not allowed to take a copy. And Julian would only be able to access those text messages once he was charged. So you have this, he was deliberately placed in this position of complete disadvantage in relation to his own defense, because at no point during those 9 years where Sweden was opening and closing the preliminary investigation was he formally an accused person. Because once you're accused, you start getting all these the rights of a defendant, and it never reached that point. And because there was no case, so there was an initial prosecutor who okayed the suspicions. Then 3 days later, the senior prosecutor of Stockholm reviewed the allegation, the more serious allegation, which is so-called lesser rape. Sorry, I forgot to mention the other ones were assault and sexual coercion in relation to the other woman. And the prosecutor said, I have reviewed the interview with the woman in relation to this so-called lesser rape. There is nothing, that is not credible about the account, but there is nothing in the account that is a criminal offense. That was the most senior prosecutor in Sweden. What happened then? There was a politician. This was about 10 days out of a Swedish general election. A politician for the Social Democrat Party who had been active who had held the role of gender ombudsman, who was also an attorney, then took on the two women as his clients and contacted a separate prosecutor's office. They kind of take test cases based in Gothenburg. And he pitched this case to the senior prosecutor there, and then she took it up. Her name was Marianne Nee. And throughout that period that Marianne Nee was heading up the case, she refused to question Julian. Now imagine this, a sexual assault, lesser rape and so on case, where the chief investigator, who was a prosecutor, refuses to question Julian. And since we've learned a lot of things since. We've learned the content of those text messages where the woman with the more serious charge, sorry, not charge, even I say it, you see, it's insane.
Right. It's so pernicious,
yeah. She says, I don't want to accuse Julian of anything. The police are trying to grab him, and I'm being railroaded. This was in her contemporaneous text messages.
Wow.
Which
how was it that both of these charges were brought about simultaneously? Because that also seems.
You said it.
Well, yes, it's like, what's going on here? Because I presume these women didn't know each other. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and so you think, well, what? It seems a bit too fortuitous that both of these events happened at the same time, and then so soon after the other string of events that you described. So obviously, there's a bit of smoke there, and of course, we're also debating whether or not there's fire where there's smoke. So that's a difficult problem. But what's your understanding of how it is that both of these charges emerged simultaneously?
No charges. Allegations.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Jeez. Allegations. Yeah.
They didn't know each other. They met on one occasion. They knew that the second woman contacted the first one, and then they spoke to each other, and they found out they had both slept with Julian, and then they both went. That's their story, that they went to the police because they wanted an HIV test because he had slept with them in this short period.
Okay.
I don't see any point in me speculating about that.
Yeah.
What I can speak to is the extraordinary behavior by the Swedish authorities in conjunction with the British authorities. So since
well, could you speculate about the motivation of the second Swedish agent, so to speak, who took on the two women as clients and who had a political stake in the issue? What exactly was she up to, and why? And why didn't she want to question
It was a
Julian?
man. It was a man. His name was Claes Borgström.
Oh, sorry.
And it was a close call in that general election in Sweden. And he was tipped to be the new justice minister if they won the case. I mean, if they won the election, sorry. And incidentally, one of the two women was also running for politics. So in that same election for a local seat. And she actually, there are text messages as well between the women where they're talking about that they can get money if they tell their story and stuff. So it's a little bit,
I see.
yeah.
So there's lots of moral hazard involved in many different directions. So let me summarize the story so far, and you tell me if I've got it essentially correct. So WikiLeaks is founded. There's a treasure trove of documents published, let's say, exposing the secrets of many powerful agencies and people who might have wanted those secrets to be kept silent. Coincidentally, at the same time as the publication occurs, on a scale that's heretofore impossible technically, there are allegations brought about against your husband in Sweden, which is the capital, let's say, of the ideology that makes such allegations possible, at a time that's extremely fortuitous for the people who whose interests are threatened by the leaks and whose interests are also furthered personally and politically by the fact of the allegations in Sweden itself. And then, despite the fact that no charges are brought against your husband, the UK justice system decides that he should be validly extradited, even though they recognize simultaneously that the fact that that is a legal necessity is a violation of a more fundamental legal principle, which they decide not to enforce in the singular case of your husband. And then, as a consequence, he jumps bail and heads for the Ecuadorian embassy. And then, do you think that decision was justifiable to jump bail, let's say, and why did he do it? And then why